Ladies and gentlemen, dear listeners, I would like to give you a warm welcome from Salzburg. And today I would like to tell you something about the German synodal path. A brief preliminary comment about me. My name is GregorMHoff. I am a professor of fundamental theology and ecumenism at the University of Salzburg in Austria, and I am involved as a theological advisor of the synodal path in Forum 1, Power and Separation of Powers. And it is precisely with this perspective, power and separation of powers, that I would like to share with you my reflections on the importance of the synodal journey. To this end, I will offer you a brief PowerPoint presentation with which you will be able to understand a little better, based on images and some text, what the synodal path in Germany is about. I would like to emphasize this. I would like to make clear the performative dimension of this synodal journey. First of all, some background. The synodal path was created in 2019 in the course of a plenary assembly of the German Episcopal Conference in Lingen. The so-called MHAGET study, which had at its theme sexual abuse by clerics of the German Catholic Church, had been studied. And in the debates that had begun in 2018, it became clear that we as a church, as a Catholic church in Germany, but also the bishops, need a very fundamental reflection on the systemic background. The starting point has therefore been the complex handling of the Catholic abuse scandal. At its heart, this has been demonstrated by the MHAGE study, a systemic problem, a protection mechanism in the church that has always put the protection of perpetrators before the protection of victims. And that has a very strong institutional dimension. Because the question here is, how was this possible? What are the reasons why the Catholic Church has not only practiced sexual abuse over and over again in its ranks, on the one hand, but also has covered it up, hidden it, really systematically disguised it? In Lingen, this was exactly what was discussed. Bishops had prescribed a date of study in which a change in the sexual morality of the church was discussed, in which new forms of priestly formation, of the priestly image, were considered. And last but not least, the question of sacralization of ecclesiastical power. At the time, in 2019, I was given the opportunity to give a lecture on this topic. And in this regard, I am a kind of contemporary witness of how these discussions were born on the study day of the synod. This includes an important experience, that is, the fact that about 2 hours before the final press conference was held, it was still not entirely clear where they were going. Where is the train going now? What do we German bishops want to do now? This present situation about having to do something and not knowing what to do has brought out the synodal path of baptism. It was decided together with the laity of the Catholic Church in Germany, the Central Committee of German Catholics, and at the time, there was no dissenting voice of the German bishops against this new model. What is this new synodal approach to the synodal path in Germany? It represents something like the realization of a new disposition of ecclesiastical power, and that is why you can see at the background an image of the first synodal assembly, bishops and lay people discussing among themselves in a room. They are not divided in an orderly manner, for example, in the arrangement of seats according to classes, that is, according to priests, bishops, and laity. No, they sat together all mixed and argued in this way. A triple two-thirds majority is crucial to the decisions that are made. Two-thirds of the bishops must agree. 2/3 of the entire synodal assembly and 2/3 of the women must agree with the crucial documents and texts. This has a high ecclesiological significance because it represents something like an epistemic separation of powers. Epistemic because to think about open questions and problems about the options for a solution, it needs to be developed together and then discussed and decided together. This means that all arguments and votes are given their own weight. It has been associated with structural skepticism from the beginning. What is the canonical status of a synodal path? Canon law provides for synods, which are held under the leadership of the bishops and the pope. Doesn't a synodal path trigger an expectation that can still be disappointing because true synodality in its decision-making is ultimately tied to bishops? Is there such a thing as a synodal change, a transformation of canon law that is going beyond canon law? From the beginning, these issues have also been discussed in a synodal manner. And the solutions that have been found so far and after the third synodal assembly last spring, that is in February, March, all solutions have been found within the framework of the current canon law, that is, in which the bishops voluntarily commit themselves to appropriate perspectives and decisions. The critical questions were directed at such kind of democratization of this church, especially from the so-called conservative leadership. Is this a new Protestant format? Will a national church be launched here? Are structural reforms at the forefront rather than the spiritual dimension? And isn't that in the end an abuse of the abuse scandal, so to speak, in which reforms are being promoted here? The decisive factor here is precisely these questions which were then discussed together on the synodal path. And the democratization of the keyword can perhaps be seen in this triple two-thirds majority. Bishops are bound with their own apostolic authority to the corresponding decisions. And in this context, the Zionist dogmatic John Heiner took had critically pointed out that an assembly in which bishops provide only half and have the same voting rights as the laity amounts to a halving of episcopal leadership. An important question where the apostolic authority of the bishops becomes its own in a new way, especially in the synodal format, because the German bishops made use of the teaching and leadership in 8 years when they agreed on the synodal path approach. Anyone who speaks of a halving of episcopal leadership competence will have to question their authority again with this decision by the bishops. In other words, they make use of their apostolic authority. This is a performative moment of a new form of synodal ecclesiality. But what changes that? And last but not least, the climate in which we consult with each other and make decisions. Lastly, how open-ended questions can be discussed. The question of gender equality, the question of theological, sexual or moral evaluation of homosexuality, the question of the place of women also with a view to a possible admission to office. This shows that social and ecclesiastical plausibility has changed and that we also have to face these processes of change. And this is exactly what is happening in the mirror of the four forums of the synodal way. The first power of the forum and the separation of powers provides a kind of basic perspective, and the basic task of this forum was adopted by an overwhelming majority of almost 80% of the synodal votes and by a majority of more than 75% of the bishops at the last plenary meeting. Therefore, it is about realizing or executing power and the separation of powers as a decisive perspective in the Catholic Church in Germany. The other three forums are assigned to this: the Forum of Priests, which reflects on the question of the priestly image; the Forum that relates to the question of women, the position of women in the church; and also the Forum on sexual morality. Here, in open discussions, real discussions arise. Take something serious above all else: the voice of God's people, who is seeking new answers to pressing questions throughout these issues. This form of synodality is eminently important. It changes the attitude, the way of life, the ecclesiological practice of the church. And this is also reflected in the fact that completely different voices are carried out on the synodal path. For example, in the first plenary lecture, a person describing himself as queer was present, and Barak Klein's statement obviously changed somewhat atmospherically, but also in the religious theological assessment of queer people. And at the first online conference, for the first time, the advisory council in question, that is, the advisory council of the German Episcopal Conference, in which those affected by sexual abuse are represented, had a voice, were able to present their perspective. And this has been a clear sign ever since that the right to vote, the agents of the right to vote in a synodal church encompass more than just bishops and also more than individual institutional representatives. They go further in all of God's people. This corresponds to the knowledge of the theological disposition of the synodal path, the basic text of the Forum Power and Separation of Powers argues very strongly with the doctrine of the Loci Theologicae, which have played a special meaning for Catholic ecclesiology since Melchior Canon in the 16th century. These Loci Theologicae are the destiny of faith. One must refer to them as well as scripture and tradition in order to claim authority for a theological statement and the formation of judgments. These loci theologica include interpreters or loci such as the councils and magisterium of the Church, the Pope, the Church of Rome, the Fathers of the Church. But there are also the so-called loci theologica alienae for foreign places such as history, reason, philosophy. Today it would be said that the cultural sciences and much more to which we must refer in order to bring up the gospel and the meaning of today's gospel. What does that mean? In this way, the informative value of this knowledge, which is effective, especially in the science of the times, is obtained from the outside. It is raised by questions and problems, and here arises a network of testimonials which must be executed alone. That is, they have a discursive sense of purpose, and this is what I call epistemic separation of powers and what already plays a role in the synodal path, and in a way that I would have to characterize as a communicative experience of the church. It is a theologically a spiritual process of discerning spirits, and this brings out the church as communion, discussing, advising, and finding decisions with each other discursively opens up questions. However, this also requires structural consequences. Therefore, an accountability of the bishop must be decided, and there is already an adopted text of the participation of the entire people of God in the election of bishops. Last but not least, there is a demand for transparency of decisions at all levels of the church and also of the question of leadership. This in turn has a lot to do with what was the starting point of the synodal path, that is, the question of what does the abuse of power in the Catholic Church really mean? How can structures be broken? The synodal path in Germany not only provides a theological model for this, but is already an action of such power and separation of powers. And that's why I like to conclude with a very personal experience. My experience in the deliberations of our Forum 1, Power and Separation of Powers, and in the plenary conference, one enters into conversation with all people, discuss and celebrate and worship together. This is a spiritual process and it changes us all. Lastly, it also shows that the international dimension actually allows for something that enables a new form of truly living Catholicity, the perspective, the real changes, the transformations, the reform processes, and I hope that in a great council, the church will really lead into the 21st century. Thank you for your attention.